Now, I'm a product manager and I work for our hybrid cloud management product called HCMX, which conveniently stands for Hybrid Cloud Management X. And the set of features that we're going to discuss in today's session will be implemented in this product. Now, I can't really assume that everyone watching this session is already familiar with HCMX, so I'm going to take a minute to, at a very high level, explain what HCMX can do for you today. At its core, HCMX manages the lifecycle of cloud services with a focus on infrastructure as service and platform as a service, and very important, with strong self-service capabilities for the consumers of such cloud services. Consumers which today can, for instance, be operations teams working on various projects in the organization. Now, with HCMX, you can provide these teams with aggregated and thus centrally managed consumption of public cloud services, but you can also offer them cloud services that are fulfilled on premises. And this is where the automation layer comes in, because with HCMX, you can basically transform your on-premises virtual infrastructure into true cloud infrastructure so that consumers can request on-premises services just as easily as public cloud services. So all from the same single pane of glass. Now, the HCMX modules that are going to be most relevant for today's presentation sit on top of all that and govern the whole thing. And governance can mean many things. It can mean controlling cloud costs. It can mean governing business budgets. But it can also mean making sure that infrastructure is compliant, which basically means that it has to adhere to a predefined set of rules. So keep all that in mind as we progress through today's content. Now, if you want to learn more about HCMX, then you'll want to attend or watch the recording of our session called Deliver Cloud Services at the Speed of DevOps, which you see marked on the universe calendar here with a blue arrow. Okay, so back to our main story. Within HCMX, we're going to develop a set of features under the name HCMX DevOps Workbench. And simply put, the goal of these features is to resolve operational and compliance-related challenges for DevOps and the use of infrastructure as code, which we're going to abbreviate to IEC for the remainder of this presentation. Now, to best understand the benefits that the HCMX DevOps Workbench is going to bring to you, we're going to tell you a story. So let me introduce our protagonists. And again, for the remainder of this presentation, think of these people as roles in an organization rather than individuals. And let's start with Shweta and Darcy on the left. Now, Shweta and Darcy are developers, and they're working on a project or a product or a value stream. Secondly, in the upper right, there's Anne, and for today's presentation, we are going to refer to her as the project manager. But this role can have many different names in different organizations, and what we're trying to capture here is the role that is bridging the development team with the business. And then finally, in the lower right, we have David. And David is our operations manager. And in that role, his main tasks are to implement the right processes and practices across the organization, but also to keep the environment stable by avoiding disruptions caused by things like operational or security-related issues, right? So needless to say, David likes compliance. And in fact, compliance is one of his most important tools to reach his objectives. Now, you may have noticed something interesting. We have labeled Shweta, so in the upper left, as application developer. But for Darcy, in the lower left, the exact role definition that we have here is IAC developer, so infrastructure as code developer. And to understand why we make that distinction, let's first, just for a minute, talk about infrastructure as code. Infrastructure as code is exciting technology that's used a lot in a DevOps setting because it allows developers to codify infrastructure definitions. And we mean that quite literally. What you see here on the screen is a very simple infrastructure definition for a virtual machine in Amazon, and every element of its configuration, so every element of the configuration of that virtual machine is completely written in code. Now, the way how this works is that you can feed such an infrastructure as code file to an interpretation and execution engine like Terraform. And then Terraform will go out and build the infrastructure that is defined in this file. And this brings us back to Darcy. Because just like tens of thousands of other developers out there, Darcy has realized that by using infrastructure as code, her team can design and deploy the infrastructure to support the application that they're building themselves. And that will allow them to innovate a lot faster than when they have to wait for IT to provision them with infrastructure resources. So Darcy's requirement is very simple. We want to use infrastructure as code technologies. Note that depending on where Darcy's organization is in their shift to DevOps, Darcy can also be part of a dedicated infrastructure as code team that takes care of creating curated infrastructure as code designs for other application development teams to consume. Now let's give Darcy's requirement a central location in this summary slide that we're going to build up as we move through this presentation. Some other roles in the organization, however, are very worried about Darcy's plans. For starters, there's Anne. And remember that as a project manager, she bridges the team with the business stakeholders. And part of her job here is to help the business to keep spend and resource usage under control. Essentially, her team gets a budget, and it's her job to make sure that they don't overspend. Now, Anne knows that the number one cause of unnecessary costs are stale resources. Resources like virtual machines, containers, and even whole Kubernetes clusters that were provisioned at some point, but that people forgot to clean up. So needless to say, Anne is not in favor of teams using infrastructure as code because it's going to lead to more of such resource sprawl. So let's give Anne's concerns a place on our summary slide. David, our operations manager, has concerns as well. Remember, for him, it's all about compliance. Now, if developers use IT interfaces to provision systems, then David has control over what's happening. But here, we're talking about developers like Darcy designing and deploying infrastructure themselves with IAC, and in a DevOps environment, these infrastructure definitions will later be used to roll out the application in production as well. Now, this is a concern for David. What if each team is going to design a completely different architecture? That's going to be hard to maintain for him and his team. What if they use outdated images that don't have required patches? What if they use or open the wrong ports? Teams introducing security vulnerabilities like this is the last thing that David needs. So let's give David's concerns a place on our summary slide as well. Now, how do we solve this governance challenge? How do we allow development teams to use infrastructure as code while at the same time taking care of the concerns of roles like project managers and operations managers? Well, this is exactly where the HCMX DevOps Workbench will help, and we'll dive into the how in just a minute. But before we do that, let's get some feedback from Shweta as well, because there are some additional pains that she wants to bring to the table. Pains that cause unnecessary delays for her. One of those pains involves dealing with secrets. And secrets is a very broad term, so for the sake of today's presentation, think cloud credentials. And these are important credentials because, as it turns out, all the development by this team is done in the cloud. But no one in the team knows very well where or how to get cloud credentials, or what to do when a set of cloud credentials expires. And this is causing days and even weeks of development downtime every year. So Shweta says there must be a better way how we can organize this. But that's not all. What also slows her down is that she doesn't have an easy way to spin up development instances. Sometimes what she needs to code and test an integration or to simulate a bug is a way to quickly spin up certain versions of her own product or of a third-party product. And sometimes she wants to do this via a web UI, but other times she needs to be able to do this from her automation scripts. So only having a web UI, that is also not working for her. Now, if we incorporate Shweta's inputs and translate everything we've discussed so far into stakeholder requirements, and stakeholder requirements is just fancy product manager speak for what do people really want, then this slide gives us a nice overview. Darcy and Shweta on the left want better secret management, they want developer-friendly access to development instances, and first and foremost, they want to use infrastructure as code technologies like Terraform. Anne wants a solution to keep budget under control and provide visibility into infrastructure as code deployments, and David wants to govern everything that gets deployed. Now, how is the HCMX DevOps Workbench going to help here? Well, this is the vision. Developers need easy access to operational resources. If you think of it, then all the things we discussed, cloud accounts, cloud credentials, infrastructure provision through code, development instances, all of these things, from the point of view of the developer, are operational resources. HCMX DevOps Workbench will be a secure and convenient way for IT to make these resources available to developers because it uses a proven, service-oriented, subscription-based model to manage the delivery of these resources to these developers, with every deployed resource being tracked and governed. Let's take a look at what this means in terms of high-level features. And let's start with features for project managers. Now, for project managers, we'll first of all implement visibility into all infrastructure as code deployments. And with visibility, we mean management interfaces, dashboards, and reports that show cost information about each deployment, as well as information that makes it clear who has deployed which piece of infrastructure for what business purpose, at which location, how long ago, and if that deployment is still actively being used or not. Now, this gives project managers insight into things that have been provisioned, but what they also need is a way to wrap some process control or subscription-based governance around infrastructure as code deployments. And an example here are approval processes, where an explicit approval by the project manager might be needed to either provision a very expensive infrastructure as code deployment or to extend the lifecycle of such a deployment. And finally, since we mentioned lifecycle, we also want to give project managers automated cleanup of infrastructure as code deployments that are no longer being used by the teams. Operations managers need that visibility as well, but they also need something on top of what we described so far, which is visibility into exact configurations and topologies. Wouldn't it be nice if, as an operations manager, you would have a web UI in which you can see all the infrastructure as code deployments, and when you click on such a deployment, you get a graphical topology overview of that deployment and all of its configuration items. The second thing we want to give operations managers is a way to offer secret management as a service to teams, with well-defined rules around lifetime for each secret and an easy self-service experience for the initial requests, but also for renewals when secrets expire. And then finally, we want to allow operations managers to define policy-based guardrails for infrastructure as code. And the idea here is that code that violates these guardrails will be flagged, and any deployment of infrastructure based on that code will be delayed until the code is improved by the developer to be compliant. This is minimally intrusive for the developer, but it still gives operations managers a solid way to ensure that teams don't create any infrastructure that will cause operational or security-related issues. And then, last but not least, there's the developers themselves. For developers, we want HCMX DevOps Workbench to function as an out-of-the-box remote state backend for Terraform. This makes it easy for developers to collaborate on infrastructure projects without having to set up anything extra. We want to further help developers by cleaning up resources after them so that they don't have to remember this and can focus on innovating. And we want to give them an easy self-service way of requesting development instances, both UI and API based. And then, finally, of course, developers themselves will also benefit from the simplified secret management, since they will now have one single interface to easily request and extend secrets. So what does this look like in terms of benefits for all these roles? Well, simply put, HCMX DevOps Workbench will allow developers to innovate faster without being bogged down by operational issues like missing credentials or slow access to infrastructure resources. Then for project managers, it'll provide an easy way to keep budget under control and identify where most of the budget is being spent. And then finally, with HCMX DevOps Workbench, operations managers won't have to worry about teams causing compliance issues when they use infrastructure as code.